your favorite album will probably be an album that you hate the first time you hear it.
That's the definition of the avant-garde, right? There's some kind of like culturally progressive force, but then there's also a like willingness to experiment with a new tool, new piece of technology.
So media consumption has been individualized. Subculture has been individualized and commodified. The cautionary tale of my last record, which was essentially like, don't get red-pilled and black-pilled. Try normal life maxing.
Welcome to Doomscroll. I'm your host, Joshua Citarella. My guest is Matty Healy, a musician, an artist, and the frontman of the 1975.
My work has always kind of served as like a cautionary tale for emerging technologies, how we're communicating, all within the context of what traditional pop music will talk about, you know, like love, relationships and stuff like that. I'm sure we'll talk about my last show, which was kind of a cautionary tale about the situation we have with young men who are dealing with articulating a kind of a modern form of masculinity, and how maybe the left, which I'm historically a part of, doesn't quite have the equipment to bring in these or capitalize on this group of floundering young men, because, you know,
we don't have the language for it.
We don't have the language, and also we don't have the archetypes.
We didn't have tools like professional managerial class. I mean, we had them from 1971, they existed, but they weren't in popular use. They weren't colloquial terms that people could like, that's like PMC.
We're in a different society now where it's all about self-actualization. It's all about becoming the best, authentic version of yourself.
Right.
Without any institutions to kind of guide you of how to do that, it's difficult, right? A lot of young men will find a Jordan Peterson video, not to talk shit on any particular academic. I'm not a very partisan person, but you will get people who will be like, basically understand that idea of being like, oh, you're a man who wants to be a man.
Right.
Here's literally 12 rules of how to do, you know what I mean? So it's
only 12.
Only 12.
Sounds actually quite easy to do.
So my last show was in part kind of a traditional rock show, and in part a performance art piece that kind of operated a bit like a play in its first act, and a traditional rock show in its second act. And the first act came from the COVID years and me becoming single over that time, and basically starting to consume from what started out as a kind of interested, a perspective of being interested in these subcultures of internet. And I started being fed all of this algorithmic kind of extremism.
They got you targeted.
They got me targeted.
Yeah.
So luckily, there's people like us that can kind of see that as an objective phenomena and not be too influenced by it. But I became aware of how influential it was. And I basically was trying to navigate of how not to get caught up in that world. So
the one thing I would add to this, because we tend to use these words like extreme and fringe and so on, but we're in a unique period of society and history where we actually have quantitative metrics about how many people watch this stuff. And the question I keep asking guests who come onto this podcast is, how do we describe something that is fringe, subcultural, or outside the mainstream if it is quantitatively larger than the mainstream?
Right.
Is there something that we need to redefine here? Like, if everybody is watching this, like maybe that just is actually the new extreme, the new mainstream, and it is not extreme. It is not fringe.
This is the problem that we'll get into in a little bit. Yeah, you're totally right that anything that becomes, listen, consumer capitalism understands trends better than anybody.
Yes,
so
it does,
as soon as something is alternative, it becomes immediately corrupted by the mainstream.
Yeah.
Now you see that in music a lot now. In its most, I think, extreme way, you have these, I'm going to single anybody out, but I'm sure you can imagine who it is. There's this group of TikTok punks, essentially.
TikTok punks.
Well, kind of, there's this new scene of very overtly alternative artists in the way that we would describe somebody who's gone to Hot Topic. Do you know what I mean? And we're in this weird place where for their young audience, they are presenting these ideas as kind of, and these aesthetics, chains, skirts, doing that, being alternative in the way we were 50 years ago, 40 years ago. And they are basically presenting authenticity as just another commodity in an aesthetic. So the fact that they are fuck the man, but all signed to like Island Records. And they're also referencing Sid Vicious in the same sentence that they reference Good Charlotte and Avril Lavigne. Now, our generation knows that that version of punk was a bunch of white dudes in suits going, oh, people like Silverchair and Nirvana, we need a pop version. And that's where you got like your kind of early 2000s alternative music, which were all the biggest artists in the world. You know what I mean?
And would you say that part of the rise of this new kind of reactionary online culture has to do with that commodification of the like counterculture, the idea of punk that you and I both grew up with? And if that is now mainstream and sold to you through like Hot Topic and everything else, then it's kind of not surprising that like the inverse of that then feels like a little bit more dangerous.
Well, it's weird for me because as I've gotten older, I think I've been able to articulate these ideas a lot better, but I've been feeling them for a long time. So, for example, when I started the band became known in this very, very interesting transition or kind of passing of the baton from traditional linear media institutions to social media, which was, so you basically used to have the Enemy that would choose a band, put them on the front cover, give you one song and say, this is your new favorite band.
I'll define for the audience the performance piece that was really a centerpiece of your last live show involved beginning with a plate of what appeared to be a healthy, hefty portion of raw meat, which you proceeded to consume in front of the audience. You then do a bit of a workout routine. You're doing some shirtless push-ups in the beginning. Behind you is what appears to be, I mean, I would not be surprised to see this performance in an art gallery or a museum. This was just a piece of performance art in the middle of a rock show. There's a wall of TVs behind you. They're playing what appears to be protest footage, different news clips. I recognize a few faces from kind of the conservative alternative media sphere. And towards the end of this, you literally crawl through the television screen and go down the rabbit hole, so to speak. So I thought it was a beautiful piece of performance art. I thought it was very empathetic. I thought it was an interesting way to explore the phenomena of masculinity that I know both you and I are very interested in, especially in the last few years. Like, we're both kind of artsy, creative types. We were not like macho jocks in high school.
Yeah, we were beaten up for being gay.
Yes, exactly. And I wasn't even gay in high school.
This is the whole thing. And I had I had long hair and that was enough.
Exactly. And now it's like these things have all been like thoroughly redefined, and it's a kind of interesting media experiment, but then also a kind of like interesting social experience just to see how the definition of masculinity has shifted within that period. And so you were exploring this through art. It naturally went absurdly viral on TikTok and a number of other places. And the public reaction to that has been kind of an interesting real-time test of, all of these different media theories at once.
It made me aware of this new culture that Brad Trammell, for people watching, which is
our good friend,
our good friend, who wrote part of the show with me. The phenomena that he coined as literalism.
Yes.
So this idea of I consume the art and the moral values within the art adhere to mine, and the person who's making the art therefore aligns with me morally and socially.
Right.
Now, art used to be less of a mirror and more of a door that we opened, And if you look at like the 90s with your kind of the culture of Gen X, they were very interested in opening as many doors as possible to see what their limits were and then going, I'm good with that. But not that shouldn't happen.
Right.
So what I thought was interesting is that for me, it was obvious what I was doing from an artistic perspective. But to a lot of people, even people with context, it was quite confusing. And I think that the reason it was confusing nowadays is because, let's call it a meme culture. So the primary discourse in like youth culture now is kind of through memes. So it's sharing these images or these ideas that are immediately very understandable and relatable.
Yes.
So if you consume something now within that environment, be it in a ClearNet environment, TikTok or something
ClearNet
like that.
is, for the audience, big open social media platforms that are free to use, that are driven by advertising. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter,
YouTube,
anything you don't have to
Google.
pay to post.
Exactly.
There's no paywall, and etc. So ClearNet, everyone can see it.
Yeah, and we'll get into that later, that underneath that you have this kind of dark forest with emerging kind of platforms, and then the one that we all know underneath that is the dark web.
A topology of internet culture.
This
So
is the whole
we'll
thing.
get into this, but ClearNet right now are just like big open social
Exactly.
media.
So-
and the responses are driven a lot by attention.
By
in this
attention
case.
and by incentive as
Yes.
well. So you have lots of phenomena that we know about in regards to, I wasn't playing any good or bad character. I was trying to be as objective in my performance about, listen, this is not where you want to end up. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So I would be doing these things that were, I think when you look at them on the screen, quite provocative, but a part of the show felt a little bit more surreal and kind of acceptable because you were in an environment where you were there to watch art. You weren't like in your kitchen.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that when you're exposed to things that require context or are supposed to elicit a real conversation in an environment that isn't really about that, you get all of these emerging phenomena happening.
Would you say that part of the conversation that ensued online was perhaps a fulfillment of the piece? To provoke these conversations to be had in the first place.
And it also got into a problem that basically there would be all of this conversation around what I was doing, why I was doing it, and what it meant. So everyone knows that that's kind of the point of performance art, to
Yes.
generate a conversation which becomes part of the art itself.
Yeah.
So I learned very much in the early days of social media that you can kind of control a narrative, right? You can control the conversation that you want to be had around you fairly well. The weird thing about that show is that every other performance like that, a performance in a gallery, a theater performance, a movie, a stand-up comedy thing, you can't film it. You're not allowed to film it. A rock show, you were invited to film it. So I had this scripted thing that on day 2 went live to the whole world. So I had to kind of keep rewriting it. So then I was reacting to what was being said. So it was becoming this quite like meta kind of thing. And this is something that you can relate to. So me and you used to, with our social media and stuff, and I think me from A Brief Inquiry onwards, we would draw from the most extreme parts of the internet.
Yes.
And we would post about them because we found that culture interesting, and we
shadow banned over and over.
All these kind of things. Now, what we were doing was presenting this new phenomena of behavior and asking people to engage with us in a conversation of what it was about, whether we make art about it and stuff like that. And because I was doing that, whenever people would miss the point, I think that I got into the habit of being like, well, my track record speaks for itself, or this is art, or context, blah, 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 blah. But what I realized that I was actually getting myself into, and I've heard you use this sentence before, is a kind of a series of moments of context collapse, where people became genuinely unaware of what I was lampooning, what I was unironically platforming, what I was supporting, and what I wasn't. So I've stopped doing that as much anymore. I think that there's a certain section of my fans that are very like me, that are very interested in this thing, that like the kind of shit posty thing, because like me and you, they like taking silly things seriously, which is, I think that we take that idea very, very seriously. But for a lot of people, what I realized is that I don't want one of my posts or something that I say or do to alienate some young person who takes their affiliation with a community, say it's like even being into the 1975, like seriously. I think that I've grown to have a bit more responsibility with the way that I talk about these kind of things.
This is precisely the question, is what are the threshold or the parameters of responsibility with a large audience, right? And I'm personally conflicted about this. This is maybe something we can explore a little bit more deeply. But just to give the citations here, so context collapse is a term that was coined by Dana Boyd, who was the founder of Data and Society, which is a think tank that specializes in social media. It is also sometimes analogized to Poe's Law, which was a rule that emerged on 4chan. But basically anything that is said in jest or in irony on the internet, given to a scale of like millions and millions of people, someone in there is going to take it 100% seriously.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of the media theory behind why we need to have certain levels of individual responsibility in what we post.
Yes.
Now, the flip side of that, my concern is that when we enforce those things too heavily, and we're saying that people are not able to deal or interpret or should not be exposed to complicated art, we're saying that most people are too stupid to get involved with art, right? And that's actually a profoundly anti-democratic thing, that they're too dumb to make up their own minds. If you extrapolate that out a bit further, it's like, well, they can't have aesthetic preferences, they can't choose what art and culture they like to participate in. Should they be able to vote? You know, there's like really weird downstream implications when you start to say that most people are too stupid to make up their own minds. So I'm willing to concede that there are certain parameters. I behave a lot more better on social media now. Before I would share all sorts of like extreme material. I mean, I literally wrote a book about it. I'm willing to have a long-form conversation. I find what is maybe similar to your experience, what really restricts the kind of like outrageous posting that I would do before is that now I'm part of an organization, I'm part of a community, right? And so I think about how my personal post is going to affect the career of like a 24-year-old BFA student who they put their work onto Do Not Research, and this is like, the thing that they get up in the morning to do, they really care about that art. And it's like, I would hate for my shit post to be misinterpreted and then negatively affect this kid who's just like aspiring to get his foot in the door for some creative career.
For sure.
That's really what holds me back now.
I have the same thing. Like I ran into a series of issues with basically, I am an artist first, and I also creatively run my record label.
Right.
So I'm not a boss, but I'm a figurehead for a lot of other artists.
Yeah.
Now, what conflicts me is I don't want my right to express myself exactly how I want to negatively impact on those people that I'm genuinely trying to empower.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And it's difficult being like different artists and being disparate and all trying to kind of operate under the same, I don't want to call it like a moral framework, but I don't know how you would describe it, a kind of a way of behaving that adheres to a 20-year-old girl or a 35-year-old man that's been doing something else. So one of the challenges for me is doing something like a show at the Garden.
Right.
That people leave saying, wow, that was a really, really interesting music show.
And you did this piece of performance art at the Garden during your live show.
We did it at some of the biggest kind of venues in the world. The energy in those rooms was electric, because I think people, we'll get into the cancellation of the future, but I think that when people go to environments and they experience something that is even in a small way new, it's very exciting. And I think that I just wanted to do something that felt a bit more reflective of what media is like now. Do you know what I mean? And how it makes you feel. It's difficult to kind of explain the show, but one of the things that I had to become aware of is that we're like quite a big band.
Right.
And there's what I'm interested in. One of the things that I think that is important for me is to take more academic ideas from my peers or my friends like you or Tremella, whoever it was, and kind of present them in an understandable and kind of appropriate way within pop music. So, you know, the reason that we didn't want to do a show at a gallery or something like that is not just because of our resentment for institutions now and art galleries, but also is because I wanted to do it in an environment that had a large audience and kind of was as much as I could make high or art with a broad appeal, you know, because it's actually ironic that as long as there's groups of people like me thinking the same way, you've kind of got more chance now of going to a rock show and experiencing a real piece of art than you do going to a museum.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the great irony, and this is similar to what you mentioned before, of as Fisher describes, the slow cancellation of the future.
So for my fans, your fans will know all about that.
Sure,
just explain that, because this is a theory that me and you riff on all the time.
Yeah. Hauntology, slow cancellation of the future. These are ideas that are coming from a pop culture theorist, let's say pop culture political theorist named Mark Fisher, whose famous book, Capitalist Realism, written in the fallout from 2008, kind of explores this problem of the 21st century of not having a political alternative. Socialism was defeated. It's capitalism from here on and forever. What Fisher is writing about is the developmental arc of neoliberalism. When we talk about lost futures, there's a perpetual nostalgia for the 80s. Now, what happened in the 1980s? It was Reagan in my country and Thatcher where you grew up, and the Volcker shock with profound interest rates and shoring up of the money supply, and the advent of neoliberalism in which everybody got a lot more poor and started to work harder for less. And so the kind of utopian imaginaries, the optimistic visions of the future that had emerged in the 60s, 70s leading up until that point began to recede from popular culture. If you look at the kind of imaginaries of, like, you know, I think of the original series of Star Trek, which I grew up watching, like they had communism in the future, they had post-scarcity. It's like, it was like utopia. People just pursue their own intellectual interests. No one wants for anything. They have replicators that just like 3D print their food all of a sudden. And the future imaginaries of the 21st century are things that are like totally dystopian. They're all falling apart. It's all like, you know, the future has extreme wealth disparity and people are living in poverty, and we're uploading our brains to the internet, and then the robots are going to kill us. That's the future imaginary that we have now. This slow cancellation of the future, something that you and I talk about a lot, corresponds to in aesthetic stagnation on top of the political and economic stagnation, in that the amount of creative risk that people could take in previous generations was proportionately more. And that was mostly because the wage floor was high, the cost of living was low, and so the total amount of decommodified time, like you could spend 25, 30% of your time just making punk music or doing your weird art practice, and you never have to worry if you like sell that album or you sell that painting, and you can just kind of experiment and, like, you know, experience the joy of creating stuff, aesthetic pleasure, and so on. And as society has become more and more privatized over the course of neoliberalism, the total amount of free time that people have to pursue creative practices is basically that has disappeared from contemporary life.
Yeah, and what it's created is this hyper-commodified sphere of art where the only art that is worth making or is possible to make is art that is successful financially or does numbers.
Has to be immediately successful.
Has to be immediately successful. So yeah, listen, you're so articulate, and what you just said had all of the information, but some people might have to watch that about 3 or 4 times. What you're kind of saying is that, like, in like the 90s, you could have a job in the service industry and you could work as a musician at night. Do you know what I mean? The economy allowed you to do 2 things. So you could make experimental music that went out to a certain group of people, and you could work in a coffee shop, and you could afford rent.
Exactly.
So the economy allowed for you to do that. Phoebe Buffay was the ultimate pop culture example of that kind of economic result of a type of artist. When, like you said, once neoliberalism kind of started to totally decay any socially democratic aspects of society, and your art funding went away and stuff like that, young people were forced to Well, there was actually this really interesting thing that happened, that when we were growing up in the 90s, the one thing you didn't do was sell out. So if you were making just enough money to live off your art, don't sign the check for Nike, because you're kind of getting into bed with consumer capitalism that our, at the time, community of artists is fighting against. Once it was so obvious that consumer capitalism and the marching horizonless motion of neoliberalism had won, young people had to change this idea from selling out to getting the bag.
Yes.
So now you get the bag.
Yeah. That was the millennial experience. It's like, I'm a bootstrapping entrepreneur.
This is it, right? So I think that what happened was that young people became encouraged to make art for money.
Right.
And the art that young people can make for money is homogenous art for big companies.
Yeah.
So for example, the most creative young graphic designer now is probably just making some flat design for an internet startup. Do you know what I mean? Because that's the only thing that they can afford to do. You have that issue, and then from a kind of class issue, which isn't so much of a thing that I see spoken about in America, because you have such a huge middle class that's very different, but I was brought up in an incredibly class-orientated environment. Like my dad I come from a kind of second generation upper middle class, and my dad was a welder who became a stand-up comedian, and then he became an actor in this TV show called Our Wiedersehen Pet, and it was a show about Thatcher's, the era of kind of the loss of subsidization of industry in the north of England, and all of these working class, blue collar men and communities of men having to go to Germany to work to make money.
Right.
And this show, it was a comedy, and my dad kind of became like a political, cultural figurehead. So I grew up in all of this kind of anti-Thatcher, very much aware of how social mobility worked. And the social mobility in my family was acquired through art. Now, the issue that we have now with neoliberalism is neoliberalism has decayed, this is a Fisher thing, but has decayed any socially democratic aspect of society that previously allowed the working class to be a dominant part of the cultural production of our society. So basically, poor people used to be able to do that. So my dad was a welder, right? And he one day downed tools and wanted to be a stand-up comedian. And from the government, just by asking them, got enough money to buy an ambulance. And him and his friend decided to do the first ever. They were touring comedians in comedy clubs where toothless henchmen would be like, I'll give you 20 pence to make me laugh. You'd be like, fucking hell. And they were like, fuck it, let's go and do a play in these environments. So they would put a small set in an ambulance, and they would drive to the Dunstan Working Man's Social Club.
Incredible.
And they would do a play to these confused people. But what that turned into was a company that still exists on the quayside in Newcastle called the Live Theatre Company. And it still is a environment that invites young people to come in and experiment with theatre. Now,
incredible.
Those kind of things just aren't funded now. So we have these these physical monuments that I actually kind of go to see. What's the word when you religiously go and
pilgrimage?
See? I almost go on pilgrimages to these monuments to see not only what my dad created, but what the kind of economy and the social fabric that I was brought up in, and I was kind of promised, created.
That's the lost future right there.
That's the lost future right there. And so what I have been really interested in over the past couple of years is we lost Fisher tragically in 2017 in the only way I think he could have gone. I would have been really interested to see what he thought about my band, because I couldn't articulate these ghosts in our society that we can all feel, but we don't really know how to put our finger on. What he was basically saying, for a lot of people who don't know his work, is that the 21st century is defined by its inability to articulate itself aesthetically and politically. Fisher puts it, the 21st century is just the 20th century on higher resolution screens. and
Indeed it is.
And the only, before the comments fill up with people talking about the elements of maybe slight short-sightedness in those writings, because I think the emergence of real subcultures that didn't last for very long, like Witch House, and the influence of, I think the most influential band of the past 20 years is 3 6 Mafia. Hands down. There is no band, or there is no group, or people who made music whose pop music references more. It's the tempo of trap music. It's they started doing this. Rapping became like that. That's all 3 6 Mafia. It's all pop, it's all trap. So black music started to articulate the 21st century a bit when we got to around about 2011 and onwards. And that's kind of when I came out. Again, just to explain this theory to my fans who maybe not quite understand it, is that we've gotten to a place now where we can't quite imagine something truly revolutionary and new. And spending the time and building the audience for that new revolutionary thing is too expensive.
It's exactly. My favorite example of this is, and it's a fantastic film, The Irishman, where when the film was sold, it has, stars Robert De Niro, and he ages, I don't know, like 40 years in the course of the narrative. It was easier to sell the film and to later invent the technology to de-age him, rather than to invest in another young actor who could play the younger version of him. And I think this is very pronounced in film. The kind of classic, the easy example of it is just this infinite reboots of films that have already been made. And that's not like necessarily, we were overdue for another one of these. Like we do these every 10 years. It's because from a financial viewpoint, it's a really risky investment to put money into any sort of new IP. So people accumulate this massive amount of data. They become very risk averse in in an environment that is not yielding a ton of profits. And they're like, I'm going to invest in the safest thing possible. And that means I'm going to do 500,000 Marvel movie reboots. And that's the only culture we're going to get. Okay. And we're going to get more Star Wars, and we're going to get it every year on Christmas or whatever. But we're never going to invest in something that is aesthetically new. You see this across film. You see it across music, you see it across art. In the art world in particular, which is my background, you see everything has now taken the shape of a 30 by 40 painting that fits over the couch because that's the only thing that can sell. Yeah. And being risk averse in a condition of declining rates of profit is just a very rational thing. But this underlying political economic situation is shaping our aesthetics and our culture. Yes. And so when you see this played out in different fields, it feels very kind of safe and boring, and it doesn't have this like radically new aesthetic experience that we had in decades previous.
Before you start this is what I want you to talk to you about, and I've written this down. I want to talk to you about the Museum of Ice-cream-ification. But this is our thing, right?
Yeah.
And this is only stuff that I write down when we're on the phone that I want to go into more with you. But what I wanted to ask you was about this concept, the Museum of Ice-cream-ification of art institutions, how they have become adult daycare centers, and the loss of gatekeeping in art institutions being a bad thing in general, how alternative institutions need to be subsidized to recreate a culture that is defined by creation rather than consumption, and AI and ClearNet platforms being anti-creation and pro-consumption. So explain to my audience the Museum of Ice-cream-ification of art institutions.
Well, okay, so if you're a young creative, you have probably grown up with this idea that what we need to do as like progressives, very broadly speaking, is we have to overthrow the corrupt institutions. That's right. That like that's the man, that's what you should be fighting against and whatever. And I would say that there's a conflict right now amongst the ruling class about how they prefer to organize society. Some people like to be patrons, but others do not. And so in the period that both you and I grew up, one of the things that was offered to young creatives was a platform in which anyone can post. There's no editors, there's no curators, there's no gatekeepers. You can bypass any opinion and just post what you want to the platforms. Those people, this is very curious and pronounced in the art world, they never donated to museums. unlike the Carnegies, unlike the Fricks, unlike all of the robber barons of the 20th century that, pillaged society, but then gave back in the form of these extraordinary libraries and museums and public institutions like the opera, for example. The new 21st century Silicon Valley robber barons have not chosen to give back to culture. And that's actually a very unique thing in the development of capitalism, because usually when people take a lot off of the table, they give something back in some way. I think that's an ideological decision, because what they would say is that we actually built all the platforms in which you can upload all of your thoughts to YouTube, you can post them to Twitter or whatever, and so now everybody is an artist, and we gave you the means to do that, to publish and so on. So
and everybody's an activist.
And well, that is naturally one of the results. So I like to take this kind of contrarian position in that what we are seeing is actually an erosion of the public sphere, and of public goods through this competing structure of the platform.
Yes.
And so I think actually the logic that we were raised with to rebel against the institutions is kind of pretty outmoded by like 20 years.
Yes,
right?
It is.
These are relatively new phenomena, like the mass adoption curve of Facebook is like 2012. So, I mean, the way in which the academy catches up to these things, we're still a few decades away. Like, we're still learning this kind of Foucault boomer, like rebel against the institutions,
exactly.
whatever. But like, the institutions are more weak than they've ever been. They were actually thoroughly defeated. Okay. And so I'm a big proponent of not using the platforms as our desired alternatives. I think we need to build new institutions.
Exactly.
I'm not saying the existing ones are savable. I think that the task of our generation, people like you and me, is to build new institutions, new trustworthy institutions. Because the platforms are turning everything into the fucking museum of ice cream, where everything is content for ad views and so on.
If you look at the new Van Gogh experience, which is an institutional art, it's an art institution, saying, come and see our art show. They are not actually expecting people to come and revel in the aesthetic delights of projectors. What they want you to do is come and create content that becomes advertisement for the institution itself. Right. Same with the Museum of Ice Cream. They are no longer art institutions. They are essentially adverts for the concept of an art institution or the art institution itself, which is why you'll go to a gallery and you'll walk in and you'll go, the Cause times Rick and Morty experience. And you'll have some art speak. But what it's actually
I could actually see that happening.
Right? What it's actually for is
it's a Brad post next week, and it's a real thing 2 weeks later.
This is the whole thing. One of the things, let's start with that idea of the ice-cream-ification of art institutions. Now, it's not just art institutions, but it's big media corporations. So take whatever example of a huge artist or a concept like Marvel. The most again, Citarella will talk about this, the most enduring product that has been created by those companies is the consumer identity of the people who are into it.
Right.
So what Marvel or other artists have realized over the past 15 years with social media and people's kind of projection of who they are, and is that being a fan of something is now a form of political identity. So when I grew up, when I grew up, if you were a super fan of something, if you went over to someone's house and they were a super fan of something, before you went in their bedroom, they would go, listen, I'm not fucking weird. Right? just don't judge me.
Are you thinking of like a specific person right now?
Yeah, there's a couple of people who whether it'd be like Oasis and you'd walk in and their room was a shrine to this thing.
It's just everywhere.
And the relationship was, I don't know how the camera can pick me up, but say there's a poster on your wall. Your relationship was looking at this poster. Your relationship with fandom now is going like this to the poster, like showing other people who you are through your kind of fandom. And you therefore become essentially a part of the promotional labor force of the company itself.
I mean, this is practically speaking, it's called user-generated content. It's built into advertising campaigns.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
how many people you can get to spread the post and share it and engagement and so on.
I don't like doing that because I think it's very, very contrived. So I try and stay away from that in the 1975 sphere. And So that's one of the interesting things, and about that kind of art institutional problem. Art and aesthetics is how we compute and understand time. And when that dissolves, the depressive flattening of culture is what Fisher talks about. And again, for my fans, let me just give like a really obvious example. If I said to anybody the 60s or the 70s or the 80s, the first thing that you would think of is the cultural producers of those times. 50s rock and roll, 60s hippies, 70s disco and punk, 80s rave and a new rave into rave and stuff like that. They were so overtly articulate in their time and who they were.
Yes.
And even if you look at compilations of the 90s of films where people go, it's the 90s, baby. We knew kind of where we were. If you say, what was the sound of 1974? Or what was the sound of 1984? You can normally figure that out. You can almost track that to the month. Whereas if I said, what's the sound of 2009?
A lot fuzzier.
It's a lot fuzzier, right? And Fisher says that it's one of the issues is that when we got to the 2000s, culture stopped feeding us this idea that a future was ever going to come. So again, to stick with the 90s, you had movies like Fight Club and The Matrix, which were, I don't think I've coined this term, maybe I've heard it, but were cubicle movies, where the protagonist was trapped in an office cubicle and it was modern life is boring. And every movie was about the future crashing into Earth. Independence Day. It was all about this future coming. And we were promised futures that involved a lot more physical technologies as well. So what happened with music is it got to the 2000s, and the biggest artists from that time were Amy Winehouse and Adele. And they were doing versions of the 60s. So what Fisher said was like, look, if you took a piece of music from the 90s, if you took a piece of Aphex Twin back 30 years,
oh my God.
Could
you imagine?
It would reimagine their content. They would go, this isn't even music. I am so stunned by how unrelatable this is. If you took a piece of music now, even from the far left field, and you took it back to somebody 30 years, which is the 90s, and you played at them, they'd be struck by how understandable and how relatable and how not different it is. Now, we've touched upon one of the reasons for that being that when neoliberalism and its horizonless kind of progression started to erode any art funding, started to erode any space where a squat or a rave or anything truly culturally generative could happen, it flattened what art is like. That is partially an issue to do with economics, but it's also to do with physical technologies disappearing. Very simply, the 60s, Jimi Hendrix and the overtly distorted guitar, The 70s, Brian Eno and the synthesizer. The 80s, kind of the Fairchild, with Peter Gabriel and Throbbing Gristle. And then the 90s, Aphex Twin and the DAW and basically Logic and Pro Tools. Now, in music, since the mid-90s, since a DAW, which is a platform where you can create music on your computer, there has been no new physical technologies.
It's all software.
Everything is software and everything is codified and everything happens in a screen. Now, if you look at the story of like when Throbbing Gristle moved to Psychic TV and Sleazy went off to do Coil, when he started Coil, he was a young person and he was part of a culture where young people were literally thinking, because they could economically and stuff like that, I don't know if I want to start a band because I don't know how it could be new. There's nothing physically new that can make what I do new. So I might not do it. And Peter Gabriel, before kind of, I think it might have been before So, or maybe a bit earlier, was kind of thinking the same thing. Then the Fairchild existed, and it opened up all of this new stuff. So one of the issues that we have now
is, I think that's the definition of the avant-garde, right? There's some kind of like culturally progressive force, but then there's also a like willingness to experiment with a new tool, new piece of technology.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
A new piece of technology that is inherently going to alienate people that are already into something that's previously successful.
And the paradigm under which I grew up, and I think you as well, is like that was kind of the point of art, was like explore these new horizons
it's really weird
for human
because,
expression.
like I said, we don't only live in a 20th century culture on 21st century screens, we also still really, really understand ideas that were so prevalent in the 20th century, like your favorite album will probably be an album that you hate the first time you hear it. Now, getting a young artist who's signed to a major label to make a record like that, this long-term investment, you know what I mean? Like it's not a profitable, feasible way of doing anything anymore. So I think that one of the problems that we have with the stagnation is that the revolution of music has only happened in the space of distribution. It hasn't happened in the space recently of creation. But I think that me, you, Brad, whoever it may be, there's these groups of people who are aware of how cringe it is, but also aware that like in the 60s and the 70s, young artists were really interested in kind of changing the world and changing the way that things meant. And now you're not really encouraged to do that. It's kind of you're getting too big for your bootstraps. And I think that one of the things that I think that me and you and other people are taking on now as a challenge, and we're just starting to have conversations about alternative institutions and stuff like that. And I want to talk to you about this charity initiative that I'm recently involved in that is hopefully going to try and challenge the idea of the lack of art funding where I came from, stopping young people being able to make music and art. But we are quite good at the diagnostic, but nobody's that good at the prescriptive. So we can diagnose all of these issues. How we actually create a new alternative is very, very difficult, because you start to think, right, well, okay then, new music isn't that new. So how do I make it new? So people start experimenting in these kind of futuristic ways. Whereas if I said to you, what does futuristic music sound like? We all still think it sounds like Kraftwerk.
It's already a genre.
It's already a genre. So futuristic music is actually a 20th century genre in the way that punk or reggae is. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of like music that we think robots would listen to a little bit.
Exactly.
Do you know what I mean? And I think that whereas I suppose what Fisher is saying is, where are the artists who come out that sound like they've never heard music before? I don't really know what my new record is going to be like, but the thing that I've been experimenting with is, because the only revolution in music recently has been within the distribution, has been the emergence of new distribution platforms, trying to use those platforms as instruments itself. So practically, you're kind of looking at Geisen and Burroughs' cut-up technique, which has essentially been what everyone's been doing as a form of collage. But for me, sampling, I'm obsessed with, from a kind of Fisher kind of idea. You know, if you want to read Ghosts of My Life, there's a beautiful piece, a moment where he talks about crackle. Well, I've never even thought about the thought of crackle in modern music, but not only is it telling you that this music isn't of now, it's also reminding you of the technologies in which we used to consume it. This idea of we're totally lost in this kind of timeless malaise, a nowhere time, as he calls it, in the way that a nowhere place would be an airport or an industrial estate. years have started to feel like airports or industrial estates. I can't remember the aesthetic difference between 2019
where
and now.
Time has stopped.
Time has really stopped,
still.
or the future has stopped. Do you know what I mean?
The future isn't coming.
The future isn't coming anymore. And so with sampling before the internet, the only things you could sample were things that were on records, so music or spoken word. Now we have everything on the internet, TikToks, personal, whatever it may be, trying to use that as much as an instrument.
It can be difficult to try and aesthetically theorize something, right? As you're trying to like, all right, well, how do I come up with something radically new? It's like, well, you wouldn't know. You have to like just kind of do it and figure it out in real time. But I feel like, one of the things that is unique to our experience of this moment that did not exist years ago is the way that people post. It is social media, right? That's where a lot of like young, creative, experimental energy has gone. I did this experiment where I tried to become a meme in the last few years. And I thought that actually like using influence as a medium was an interesting 21st century experiment. And there's a few artists of my, like broadly speaking, the post-internet generation that have experimented or done projects in this field. But, similar to how like VHS and experimental video work was like, that was new and weird in like the 80s.
Exactly.
Like, I think this is actually a good medium to be experimenting in.
This is for me, when I look at the work that we talk about as taking silly things seriously, the reason that
like VHS art was not considered a serious pursuit.
No, if you were making video
now
art,
it's in museums.
So weird. Yes, and this is the thing. So everything, it's not perceived as legitimate. It's perceived as kind of kitsch.
Yes.
And this is the thing with memes, which is where me and you talk a lot about taking silly things seriously. The reason that we take meme culture, the reason that we take it very, very seriously is because behind this new model of communication and discourse predominantly going on amongst you people is a real set of social circumstances and economic circumstances and environments that they're kind of reacting to and talking about. And I think that in the way that I've always been a massive champion of comedy, not just comedians, but the idea of using humor to delineate important ideas, because the idea of comedy is to take the biggest ideas possible and convey them in the fewest words possible. It's the same with music and lyrics, and it's the same with memes. Like sometimes a joke, when sometimes in comedy, somebody will say something to an audience and the audience will go, ooh. They never go, ooh.
You get the same thing with memes a lot.
The truth is the laugh. And then after that is the acknowledgement of whether I should be allowed.
That's the super ego coming back. Yeah, it can slip under your critical faculties.
So what humor does is it's the sharpest knife in the drawer. Like a meme, a perfect, like for example, we were talking about the concept of late stage social media. Right?
We're deep in it now.
We're deep in it now. And we could talk academically about all of those points, and you could do a video, Tramel could do a video, I could do an album on it. But the best example of late stage social media was that tweet I sent you the other day.
Which one was that?
I just had a dream that I had to download the cilantro app to use my bunch of cilantro.
Yes.
And
we're not too far away from that.
We're not too far away from that.
Yeah. When you're in the studio, you have a rule well, as you told me, you have a rule to not bring up anything on Spotify, to not bring up references of like, oh, this is a pre-existing track from another artist, like let's take inspiration from this. You're trying to innovate something new and not get like stuck in repeating old genres of the past.
That's true. So that was something that I've become really, really strict with. My good friend and longtime collaborator, even though a lot of the stuff that we've made has never seen the light of day, BJ Burton. We were making a record for a while before I went off and made it with Jack, and George made it, because we were really, really interested in this idea of newness. And I actually got into this full circle place on a brief inquiry where we'd made such what I felt was 21st century record with notes on a conditional form, which, yes, constantly referenced music from the past, but in a way that I felt was inherently 21st century. Do you know what I mean? Like I said, I've always said, I'm from the generation that creates in the way that we consume. And I think that doing that, the break away from genre was quite a new, hopefully fishery thing for us to kind of do. But
you mean like generationally, like the kind of genres that we grew up in? It's like you think of yourself as like a punk or a metalhead or something like that.
And I think that basically, you would historically make music in a genre.
Right.
And in 2009, when all the record labels, the institutions were coming to see us, they were confused because I would play them they'd play 4 songs that sounded totally different, and they'd be like, but I don't get it. And I'd be like, but my generation will. They'll just inherently understand
you were right about that.
I was right about that, which is why I ended up owning my own label, and all of their labels died. But
the Gen Z kids I interview and talk to, none of them identify with like, I'm this specific genre. They just consume from everything.
So we'll get into why that is in a minute. But for me, on the last record, I was like, okay, I've just made a experimental modern record, right? What is actually fresh now? Because we talk about Witch House, we talk about that emerging subculture, and I remember hearing artists like Triple XYYXX or whatever it is, and you would hear this music that was created by a 15-year-old on a laptop, and that had never happened before.
Right.
So when you heard this, you'd be like,
it was exciting.
You'd be like,
it was
what
weird.
is this? Right? Now, when you hear something someone's made on the laptop, it's like watching Transformers 2. It's like, it doesn't mean anything. I know that it's impressive, but it doesn't mean anything.
Before.
So I got to a point being like, right, well, we're past the bedroom. What's interesting, I was like, what can we do that other people can't right now? And I was like, well, we've been in a band for 20 years. Maybe just like being a band, it's actually quite revolutionary because there's no bands. So leaning into the traditional aesthetics of what a band is, maybe we should do that. So I did that for a record, and that required, I suppose, not necessarily referencing, but understanding the history that we were drawing from, and not from a woke perspective also, but because we're such a rhythm-based band, I'm always referencing black music more than I'm referencing white music, and it's important to acknowledge that, you know? So it's always been important for me to kind of like pay homage to the people who did that. But basically on the last record, I was like, I'm going to make something quite rootsy and traditional, because rootsy and traditional is actually quite subversive now. After we made that record, the idea of stopping ever referencing anything came in. So we try not to listen to other music or pull from other things that exist.
What about just the existence of bands in 2024? Is kind of like an anomalous thing. Everyone, you mentioned before, like 15-year-olds making music on their laptop. Like everyone, or not everyone, but most people I know who are in music are in kind of like, it's either one person or maybe it's a duo, but very rarely do people have like full bands, definitely not ones that have been together for multiple decades, where they have instruments and they have like whole performances. We live in a very kind of atomized musical landscape right now, I would say.
We live in a very atomized landscape. Like, you know, I think the death of the living room is just as relevant to the death of the band. You know, the living room used
nowhere to rehearse.
Well, not so much that, but the way that the fire was replaced by the TV, the radio, and then the TV.
Right.
So the TV used to be in the living room where we would all live together, and we would come together and we would watch one screen, and we would talk about what was happening on the screen. We then got our own screens, and what was happening on the screen, we no longer said to the person next to us, we tweeted to 1,000 people.
Right.
So instead of having mum, dad, and the teenager and the 8-year-old all watching the TV at night and fighting over what they want to watch and the remote stuff and the teenager who always changes the channels, now you just have everyone on their own screen. So media consumption has been individualized. subculture has been individualized
Right.
and commodified. So when I was growing up, if you wanted to be a goth or a punk, you had to find out where they hung out. You had to physically go there. You had to build up the confidence to talk to them. You had to immerse yourself in a world of cultural and aesthetic references that you didn't know, that you either had to pretend to know and then go to a library. And all of these people's references you knew were authentic because social media didn't exist. You know that they had read this book or been to this show or seen this movie. They hadn't just revised a Wikipedia article on it. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
So you would immerse yourself.
There was a barrier. There was like a hurdle, a small barrier to entry. Yeah.
And
you had to do certain stuff to join the subculture.
This is the thing. And a process of qualification.
Yeah.
And with that process of qualification, you acquired a kind of social identity. You immersed yourself in a community and you realized that if you bind together with a group, we do this quite a lot now, but in real life, your IRL friends versus your online friends, if you bind together in real life, you can create something bigger than yourself as an individual. That's where the 1975 came from. We should bind together and just make this aesthetic world for ourselves, do you know what I mean? Which meant that when that happened and we went out on tour, we were together, we were a unit, we had a community. Any oppressive Machiavellian forces from the media or whatever had to come up against like the four of us who were willing to like physically fight people. Do you know what I mean? But when social media came along, the idea of being a band isn't incentivized. The idea of being an individual is incentivized.
Sure.
A lot of a band, you'll see, each member will have their own social media.
Right.
So whether they talk about it or not, they are in competition with each other as individuals.
Exactly.
So that's not healthy for the greater good, right? You shouldn't kind of have that in a band dynamic. Now, I think that the idea of doing that, it also gives yourself kind of like a bit more confidence because there's four of you. Do you know what I mean? And I think that so people don't adhere to subcultures anymore. And also people don't dress like groups of people anymore. I was in New York yesterday and I bumped into Albert Hammond from The Strokes, who's a friend of mine. Now, fucking hell, if I'd have said that 15 years ago, I would have shat my pants. You know what I mean? The last white band, to change how everyone dressed. They changed how an entire generation dressed. No bands have done that since, right? And I think that what people do now is they dress like, or they adhere to individuals.
Right.
A particular Kardashian or whatever it is. Do you know what I mean? The idea of grouping, I don't know what a scene of kids look like, which is why I think like Dazed or Vogue are constantly trying to make everything
scrambling for micro trends.
Or core business core or long hair core or whatever the fuck.
Like if you went to like the lunch table, the proverbial lunch table, like how would you identify, it's a different school, like what your crew is? It's like you'd look at their t-shirts and their pants or something like that. That's much more difficult now. Like groups of friends don't look like each other or dress like each other.
The best articulation of that concept of how fast a generation's values has changed. Because if you look at like the generational values of young, or the cultural customs of young people from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s, there's a bit of a change. But 21 Jump Street does it so well. Because 21 Jump Street is about two guys who I think it's like 2009 were at high school. Right. And 5 years later, they come back to high school. And Channing Tatum is concerned about what way to wear his bag.
The one strap instead of the two.
And he's met with loads of climate activists who are all queer. And he just fucking hits one of them. Because when I was at school, if you were gay, you got hit. And the whole school's like, bro, what the fuck are you doing?
I got checked into lockers for being too gay.
This is the whole thing. And that's
what it was like when we went to high school.
And that immediately changed. Do you know what I mean? It's because like, so I don't really know what a scene or a subculture kind of looks like now?
Well, this is not to get like too meta on it, but the generally, like speaking, the disappearance of a mainstream and a counterculture, I would say, is a direct result of what you described before, of like there was this one screen that the whole family was around, or like the whole group of friends or whatever, and they had each their own kind of individual preferences, but they were constrained by there only being one screen.
Exactly.
And so someone who might have preferred to watch the Sci-Fi Channel versus someone who preferred to watch Animal Planet, they had to like negotiate over who got what time, and their options were constrained by having this one TV. And now when everyone has their own individual screen, it's not really clear what the mainstream preference is and what the countercultural preference is.
That's exactly
They're
it.
all just individualized. And so the counterculture and the mainstream have all kind of like disappeared into just advertising revenue for platforms, period.
Exactly.
And it's not really clear like what kind of oppositional cultural forces, or like how you delineate belonging to a subculture and not belonging to a subculture, because everything is basically just a product of your consumption habits. Like you're clicking into this or clicking into
This
that.
is the thing, like,
but you're not showing up anywhere.
we...
You're not like dressing in a certain way or like doing activities with certain people.
I think that's why me and you, no, I keep saying me and you as if we're going out, but I think that one of the reasons that we use the word clear net to describe that space is because the mainstream doesn't make sense.
Right.
When you've got, you know, what was that acronym? The intellectual dark, you know, that,
yeah,
right?
the
That group of
IDW?
intellectuals.
Yeah.
When you've got them, or the Daily Wire, or Stephen Crowder, or you know, ContraPoint, or any side of it, when you've got these people amassing more views than CNN and Thingybob combined,
Right.
do you know what I mean?
A lot more views.
What is the actual mainstream?
Yeah.
Now, this idea of kind of what is alternative has plagued me since the beginning, and it's one of the things that I've had to really stick to my guns with, because I think that culture has caught up to the 1975 a lot more than we have kind of adhered to culture, because we were hated when we first came out, and we were hated in particularly by The Enemy and The Fly. Now, I personally hated them back for personal reasons, but part of me now would love an institution that is run by a series of people that, yes, may be self-serious and cringe in regards to how cool they think, but have at least gone through a process of qualification, and are there because of their taste, that are that are giving me pieces of art that they think are interesting, as opposed to being fed pieces of art that are doing well.
Right. I think that your work is anomalous in this field, because the overwhelming incentives, the power law distribution of the content that thrives in a platform method of distribution, whether that's Instagram or streaming music or whatever it happens to be, when there's not an editor or a gatekeeper or a curator in place, most of that content, most of that material is just dopaminergic slop. It's just bad work, and there's no space for art.
Yes.
I can't think of another mainstream artist that would dare to put a fucking piece of performance art in the middle of their rock show.
Yeah.
That just simply doesn't exist.
It doesn't.
And so this disappearance of the possibility or space for art in society, if we cede everything to the platforms, algorithmic filtration, recommendation of everything, we're going to have a society without art. We're going to have a society with just content, and it's going to be vertical videos, slop, feeding culture into the meat grinder, and just spitting out TikTok reels on the other side.
Also, and if we allow that to happen to more entertainment, because you can, let's put art as in the realm of, art is great when you've eaten and you're not having an argument with a loved one.
No, that's true.
You're not interested in art if you're hungry or if you're having serious issues. So let's call art entertainment. Yes, if we allow the decimation of art, or if we allow art to become completely For You pageified, the same thing will happen to all human experience, which is one of the dangerous things about the phone. What Silicon Valley understands about the phone is that a lot of people will say this thing, which is true. I know about my phone use and how it's dangerous, but I need my phone. I need my phone for work. I need my phone in case someone contacts me. That's true. The problem that we have is that the way the apps are laid out and prioritized is flat. So you will get a notification about somebody that you've never met in your life liking a photo that you made 3 weeks ago, with the same tenacity
Right.
or priority as a text message from your mum.
Right.
So we just bounce between genuinely authentic human experience, talking to people, to just going on Reddit for 10 minutes and then flitting back between it. And I think that the flattening out of all experience and the incentivization of short-term pleasure over long-term satisfaction is a problem. You know, like long-term satisfaction was what I was trying to go to with the show. You know, it's a bit like, you can't make a TikTok at the beginning of this show and understand it without watching the whole show. Like the first chapter of a book doesn't have any context or make sense until you've read the whole book. Do you know what I mean? But that's not the way we operate anymore. I don't have time to read a whole book. Do you know what I mean? So that's what my show was trying to do in a world of short-term pleasure incentives, the dopamine, the like, the chocolate bar, the wank, versus the walk, the making the meal, the meaningful conversation, as you would call something part of normal life maxing. Do you know what I mean? Which is really important to practice. But just to go back to the point that we were talking about before, about how alternative culture has been a confusing idea for a long time, that I was talking about how I was hated. The reason I was hated back in the day is because we came out as a band, and every band that got signed over us was a band that was essentially doing an impression of the Arctic Monkeys. So what they were saying is a band has to be kind of from an economically deprived place in order to have authenticity. It needs to be kind of gritty. It needs to reference the kind of, at the time, the aesthetics of post-punk. So like, you know, all of your Joy Division, industrialization, Thatcherism-y kind of brutalism, all those kind of things. And we just didn't adhere to any of that. And because I was saying we create in the way that we consume. So we were like hated for essentially being a band that was the opposite of heavy. And I was like, well, after The Shape of Punk to Come came out.
Incredible album.
The last punk album. And it knew that. Anybody who wants, you have to get into Refused. You have to find the documentary. It's only on YouTube in Swedish, about when their last show got shut down and they split up. They split up because they were politically so different.
Wow.
Can you imagine that now?
Yeah.
They just couldn't politically align, so they split up. And in their last show, the cops came. It makes me want to cry. I get chills thinking about it. The cops came in, and all of their fans turned around and shouted the line from Rather Be Dead, I'd rather be alive. And they're just shouting, I'd rather be alive, I'd rather be alive, as Refused physically disbanded on stage. Like, incredible, right? For me, when I saw that, I thought, I can't do something heavy that touches on that. Because for me, heavy was like, unless you're like Glassjaw, Converge, Refused, or further than that, heavy's fucking lame. Do you know what I mean? Like, since hair metal, heavy's lame. So the reason we're not heavy, and we can do heavy all day long, but we're not because it wasn't new. We wanted to be something quite new. Now, the only thing I could think of at the time of being new was being representative of this new form of cultural consumption, which is everything, everywhere, all at once.
To give a little bit of the historical frame, when we talk about the left in the context of the US, there's the old left, which is like Eugene Debs. This is like 1910s, 1920s. The International Workers of the World, the IWW, the Wobblies. And these were like the struggles that basically like shaped American life within that period. The rebellions at the West Virginia coal mines, the like rednecks, like literally with the red scarf, where they're like shooting at the people who own the coal mines and trying to take back their town. Really like kind of radical struggles that were very much based in like the workplace and the degradation of life under capitalism. when we talk about the new left, we're talking about a particular slice of students, particularly the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society. So it's almost hard to draw a continuity between these things. That like one was just an enormous kind of workers movement, and the other was kind of like a niche intellectual movement in like, elite universities or whatever.
And the situationists and people like that. Well, that was after.
Yeah. But there's this kind of like, there's a lineage here of basically, really broadly summarizing, replacing the historical subject or the revolutionary subject not being the worker, but being the student or being the activist. And so for me, from my perspective, this is a fundamental category error, because being a student and having ideas is not the source of value in society. Like, value comes from labor. That's what produces society's wealth.
Yeah.
It is the only political lever that actually matters. And so if you don't have a strategy or political theory that addresses the actual lever of power in society, you're not going to get anything done.
Exactly.
What was also very popular among the new left, broadly speaking, was a kind of embrace of individualism rather than the class identity. So there was a real focus on identity politics of the era that has a certain continuity to now, especially as it enters elite academies and universities. And then there was also just kind of like a personal libertine ethics and a kind of like, finding yourself through consumer preferences that is totally copacetic with navigating the platforms and consumer identities and so on. So a lot of the kind of unlearning that we're having to do in this period of American life, especially on the political left, is just kind of like parting with the bad ideas that were taught to us in certain universities, that were inherited from the boomer generation, that were totally ineffectual, that in many cases...
You don't want a salary, stuff like that.
Well, I think some of them got just a little bit kind of too comfortable in many cases. Like there's a great book, we've talked about this before, from Fred Turner, from counterculture to cyberculture. And this is going to sound totally wild for people who have not encountered this before, but literally the people who moved out onto the land, particularly in California in the 1960s and 70s, started all of these kind of lefty communes. They then moved back into the Bay Area, literally found Silicon Valley, and then become the people who inaugurate
and embrace
the internet. They become these kind of like
Rand and all of these new kind of
these like kooky fucking libertarians of the 90s. And so that drift from within 20 to 30 years of being from on the radical left to being on the radical neoliberal right, there's actually a continuity of idea within that because they prized individualism over their solidarity and class identity, it was very easy to make that transition over the course of a few decades. So having good principles when you start out, having good political theory, all of those things I think are super important. We're also both fans of the extraordinary documentary series by Adam Curtis, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace.
All of Curtis's stuff, from hypernormalization, whether it can't get you out of my head, but All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, I think is our
personal favorite.
Yeah,
I used to show it in class. It's just like, it's really,
I would also, for fans of mine watching, if they can, try and get hold of Josh's syllabus. If you're interested in the kind of content that we share or that kind of seems to inform a lot of our work. So hippieism is a reaction of going, okay, well, if we can't transform society, if we all transform ourselves as individuals, by proxy, we will transform society. And then the 70s, still trying to articulate this kind of new form of individualism. You have woo-woo 70s, new age kind of stuff. And then when you get to the 80s, you get consumer capitalism essentially going, oh, you guys want to be individuals. I can help you with that. Here's a fucking Coke and a car and stuff like that. That's how I've always recognized that kind of movement of consumer capitalism's understanding of the emergence of the individual. Do you know what I mean? Because we don't have a lot of framework to operate as individuals in places, in our kind of places. But again, this is a question that I'm asking you.
Well, I would say that the emergence of the a theory where the individual is the unit that changes society is that comes from liberal political theory, right? There's not a kind of class analysis in that. And I think the problem that the New Left faced, which is, in fairness, a very difficult problem, is that in the period of the 1960s, like, liberal democracy was working quite well. Like, my mom's a boomer. She's of that generation. She had the best slice of the American economy, was raised in a working class family with a single mother, and now she has a master's degree and owns a home. And like, things generally, like, that kind of upward mobility is actually quite rare in, capital L liberal, think capitalist society.
Yeah.
And so what the New Left, the kind of student radicals, faced at the time was, like, broadly speaking, the working class was not receptive to their message because things were going well. Like, what's the alternative? You want to go to the Soviet Union? Like, things are working better in the liberal democratic model.
Which is where the Red Scare was kind of propped up by that kind of idea, right? The fear of communism was a kind of a fear of status quo change and the status quo being incredibly comfortable, right?
Yeah.
Whereas now we have a young group desperate to break out of the kind of environment.
Yeah. Well, because now, liberal democracy is clearly not working for most people, right? There's just kind of endless quantitative data about this that, look at our cities.
I think we're in the same place where they do,
like,
the same studio where they do Soft White Underbelly, which I think is a good example of how where we are right now is kind of surrounded by so many kind of people who have been failed by this.
And this was not the case of in American life, a few decades before. But in this, economic climate of neoliberalism, like, things are just so incredibly expensive that most people are not given, like, the dignity and necessary materials to have, like, a dignified life. So part of that, I would say, is the retreat from the class analysis that was necessary to have an organized labor movement, to, like, demand the political changes that we saw, which allowed for that kind of prosperity in the era of the post-war boom.
Right.
So that's a big part of my project, my kind of thorny contrarianism against the kind of New Left ideas, is that, one, they didn't work, and two, we just have to do a bit of relearning for the things that actually did work. We need material leverage, and the individual approach, the activist or the student activist approach, is just not sufficient to scale to any of these real material problems. Like, the individual approach for climate change is never going to work.
Well, I think
you can't recycle enough in the world.
I think that as much as we need, like, institutions to come back to kind of gatekeep certain to gatekeep the kind of integrity of certain, whether it be art forms or kind of positions, I think we really need the same for, like, activism again. Because what social media has done is made everybody an activist.
Yes.
But what that's done is completely degraded the work of real activists.
Right.
There's that like modern, there's that Norm Macdonald's joke, which I'll murder, but he goes, when he's talking about, people get described as a modern day philosopher. And I think that's quite offensive to modern day philosophers. And there's a kind of, there's this thing where, whether it be an actress or a model, they'll be like actress, mother, coffee lover, activist.
Oh yeah, everyone's got this in their bio now.
They won't be like actress, coffee lover, neurosurgeon. Because they know that they're not a neurosurgeon.
Yeah.
So activism is something that now is the most important job in the world.
Yes.
But everyone is it.
Right.
So I think that even the concept of being active now, we are bored of. Remember, like, the SJW thing of, like, 2016?
Oh, of course,
and then you got this back forward of everybody on the left being indoctrinated by the right because it was a way of owning the left. Do you know what I mean? All that kind of thing. Like, I had a very, very... It's really interesting how I think what we've come to understand is that what people need more than anything is some form of attention and some form of... Now, this is a very trite observation, but at the core of it, where are a lot of these behaviors coming from? Do you know what I mean? I think we wrap them up in politics, in intellectual thought, but the truth is a lot of it is just about getting attention. I don't want to... I've had dinner with this guy before. He's a sweet, nice guy, Winston from Mumford & Sons. Not talking shit about him, don't want to talk shit about anybody, but just to use him as an example. He was the banjo player from Mumford & Sons, okay? And one day he was actually in a month of tweeting about what he was reading. He'd tweeted previously that he was reading Mao to no reaction. And one day he tweeted that he resonated slightly with a book by that guy. Is it Nick Ungyo or somebody like this? Is it Ungyo? Some right-leaning pseudo-academic. And he got cancelled on Twitter. And massively cancelled, or in his version, massively cancelled. And what happened to him is that he decided that this was going to be the hill that he was going to die on.
Happens to a lot of people.
Happens to a lot of people. Yeah, and what happened was he became adopted by the right, essentially in order to own the left, which is what happens with left-wing figures. Now, the thing is, what I think that people, now I genuinely believe that I don't doubt his sincerity in this journey, but I think that what a lot of these people aren't quite aware of what's happening is that, it's really, because we're in an attention economy, about attention. If you're the banjo player in Mumford & Sons for 10 years, there is X amount of attention you're going to get in real life or online, right? So you get used to that amount of attention. Then one day you do something that gets you more attention than you've ever got. And you're 10 years into a career of a band that's kind of on the down, and you're presented with an option. Do I want loads of attention, or do I want the same amount of attention I've always got? I want the more attention. So the mental gymnastics that goes, oh, I'm actually a martyr for the right. As opposed to
this thing that I literally just read and had no familiarity with before. I'm now a martyr for this cause.
So that's one of the things this is the thing with me and my show as well. And, when I talk, it's easy for me, I laugh with you and my friends, and I read the stuff going on when the stuff's going on about my show. But for me, because I am essentially a kind of musician and a writer, but kind of like a writer on these phenomena, I always see internet phenomena objectively. And it's really interesting because we were talking about it before, sometimes the subject of the phenomena is me. And I think that people can't understand, because people are the protagonist in their online story. The difference between me is that me and social media for me is this is what I do. Social media for most people is this is who I am. So if social media is this is who I am, you can't imagine using social media or experimenting with that in a way that doesn't literally reflect who you are.
Right.
So people essentially...
There's not a space for art.
There's not a space for art. People would, whether it's criticize or analyze my behavior, and they would be like, well, Matty will be and it's like, it's interesting because people will think that you take it very, very personally.
There's an incredible rigidity in how people interpret things that are said online. And behind that is seemingly an amount of political certainty that's unquestionable, right?
There's two things going on there. So you've got the fact that being measured doesn't work anymore. There's a really, really interesting study recently about being measured. So, for example, if you are measured on social media, you don't get a reaction very much. So here's a good example. Who's a good, like, I've already mentioned, okay, Jordan Peterson, fine. No, because I've heard Rory Sutherland use this example. I'll use the same example as Rory. If I tweeted, I kind of enjoy listening to Jordan Peterson in small amounts on certain topics, right? That's a totally fair thing to say, right?
Sure.
The reason that you've learned not to say that is because with that, you're going to annoy both sides. You're going to get negativity from the Jordan Peterson side, and you're going to get negativity from the anti-Jordan Peterson side. You need to choose a side to perform to, right? So not only being measured doesn't get you the desired outcome, they've actually done studies in this that it doesn't actually feel good.
On behalf of the poster.
On behalf of the poster, when people tweet something really measured, they don't get the same feeling.
Just a reasonable opinion doesn't give you a dopamine buzz.
Doesn't give you a dopamine buzz. It has to be something that's a little bit electric and a little bit spicy. So if you apply that, then we're not really taking any ideas seriously. So if I'm criticized online, don't do it online. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't, I can't take opinions that seriously that operate in a Twitter or an Instagram kind of space, because you're not rewarded for being measured.
The incentives are just,
Exactly.
Everything has to be the most extreme, the most sensationalist, the most outrageous version of itself.
Which is why I think that my show worked at pushing those buttons, because it elicited an immediate reaction that kind of stayed the same in your clear net spaces, and then at the deeper of it, Reddit being right at the below of the clear net, underneath, that's when the conversations about actually what was happening was going on. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I remember before verified accounts, we were very active in early social media with the 1975, because I had this obsession with, where are we, 2012, 2013, I was like, we have access to all information, right? Every single band is on, it sounds old, is on MySpace, is on Pure Volume, is on YouTube. Right. If you can't find something on Google immediately and understand it, it's inherently quite sexy. That was how I felt at the time. So when the 1975 came out, our early EPs, especially our first song, Face Down, in the blogosphere, it came out at the same time as like Peso, ASAP Rocky, the early Weekend EPs. But yeah, we were very interested in playing with the internet as a form. So basically saying it's this huge information pool and there's too much of it and you can find out access. So why don't we make people unsure as to whether we are a brand or as to whether we are a solo artist or a music. Let's just open it up. Do you know what I mean? And we had a lot of fun. So what I was saying that is before verified accounts became a thing, the way that social media platforms would verify you would follow you back. So we were the first band or art page to be followed by Instagram. So when Instagram had followed 20 people, the 1975 was one of them.
Wow.
It was a big deal when it first happened.
That's internet history.
So what we would do is we, for a start, went on an American tour, which 10 years ago couldn't have happened because people wouldn't have heard our music if it wasn't for the internet.
Right.
We went and we played these shows in America. And what we would do every day in the Tumblr Instagram era was take a Tumblr-y, Instagram-y photo of the environment that we were in, not of the band, not of anything else, just something abstract, and we would post it. And the allure was massive. People were just loved because it felt like, in the way that when you used to have a band and a vinyl, the only thing you had was the artwork and your imagination. You need to, art can't be too didactic, because you can't have questions answered for you. You need to bring your imagination, your personal experience to it.
I would say that your work, in particular your performance during the last live show, I also think of the video for Love It If We Made It, that these are two pieces, and there are many others, but those two are, I think, most prominent in my mind, that these are probably the rare encounters that a mass pop audience has with high art. That if I walked into a gallery or museum and I saw this performance, I wouldn't be surprised. It's, oh, this is the kind of work that belongs here. And similarly, if I saw that video being played in an exhibition at a museum, gallery, what have you, I'd be like, this is a piece of video art that makes sense. It's put together, there's intention behind it. And those things are actually like very, very rare in society. And that experimental space is extremely, I can't think of another person who's doing that.
Well, thank you. And I wish there was, maybe there is on a smaller scale. There needs
on a smaller scale.
There needs to be more, because the thing is, it's so exciting when it happens, even if you're somebody that really, really understands all this theory. So for example, when we did the Hollywood Bowl show that me and Brad wrote, and because the staging was different, we had to riff and write and loads of bits. Followers of Trammell or yours will know his famous Casper mattress joke, which is one of my favorite online jokes anyway.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
What we did that night was we wrote this piece that's still out there somewhere called The Sponsored Apology. And it was about the idea that, the idea of sponsorship and authenticity, these cross sections kind of overlap. So what I did was I was in, I was getting, whatever you want to call it, getting cancelled, or there was a required apology from me. And what we did was we took 5 minutes in the show and we wrote this fake but soundingly real apology that started out with me saying, I don't want everything I do to be perceived literally, but also I don't want people to mistake my intentions with my desire to kind of create like artistic environments. And then at the end of the apology, I said, but everybody wants to better themselves. Do you know what I mean? And there's no better way of doing, and I turned to the camera and I said, and for $17.99 a month, BetterHelp, and then an advert for BetterHelp came up, right? And we did that, and it got this huge laugh. People were so confused, and then we went into It's Not Living If It's Not With You, one of our biggest hits.
I love that
Now,
song.
Brad knew what we were going to do, and afterwards, Brad was like, it's amazing that we're doing this. We're doing that type of art.
Yeah.
That critiques the things that we really want to critique. At the Hollywood Bowl,
Right.
going into a song that has however many hundreds of millions of streams across the thing. So as much as I can be like, yeah, it is good that I'm doing that, I'm more like, how are more people not doing that? As much as I understand, in the same way that I understand, like, to become a billionaire, you don't really care that much about culture. But I don't know how there isn't one billionaire that's really into music that walks past CBGB's, sees that it's now a John Vivantos shop, and goes, I'm just going to buy that and turn it back into CBGB's. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know where.
No, I couldn't agree more. There's we talked to Amber Frost, right? She wrote this incredible article a few years back. I used to teach in my syllabus. It's called The Declining Tastes of the Global Super Rich. And I absolutely agree that we have a crisis among elites. There used to be this idea of noblesse oblige, that if you were unfathomably wealthy, yeah, it's in the notes. Exactly. This is a responsibility. If you take so much from society and you have all of this wealth, fucking give something back.
Okay.
We have some shitty elites. They just built us social media platforms, and they didn't give any libraries or museums or anything else. Give me a fucking break.
This is the problem. So let's talk about noblesse oblige in the context of, the elites not doing what is required. So the idea was back in the day that we used to have the aristocracy, right? Mm-hmm. So you were born into these upper classes. You were born into the aristocracy, right? But with that, back in the day, when that was the ruling class, there was this sense of noblesse oblige.
There was a responsibility that came
so
with
a lot
it.
of these people would go into civil service, civil engineering, whatever it may be. There was this inherent feeling of, I need to give back. Now, once the aristocracy as the ruling class in the 70s got replaced by the exam passing. Basically, the academics and intellectuals who had passed exams became the kind of new, almost like ruling class. That sense of noblesse oblige started to disappear because there was an idea of, you look at Silicon Valley or your kind of Ayn Rand.
Yeah, the new money does not give to culture.
Exactly. So with that is that now there isn't this inherent kind of social pressure to give back. You know what I mean? And I think that
I think we should be publicly shaming these people for it. Not that that's enough pressure, but just to kind of like to lay out what the conflict, the crisis is here, is that the alternative to the institutional model, which necessarily requires patrons, there's got to be some rich person who foots the bill for the opera, for example, right? Like opera's never going to operate as for profit. Everything that exists on the platforms operates for profit. And the underlying assumption of this is that all culture needs to be supported by consumers and that nothing should be decommodified or not operate under the profit motive. And so the institutional model from within that framework seems vastly preferable to me, that there should be basically some rich person who foots the bill, and then there's a giant air-conditioned, beautiful opera for people to attend. And if you don't have that, eventually you get people with pitchforks, and we know where they'll be coming for.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, opera's a good example as well, because things are starting to become, everything's starting to become opera in the way that opera is a refined, what do you want to call it? Performance or something.
Crystallized.
It's a crystallized activity.
A little time capsule.
That we go to expect no change.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that music and art is becoming like opera, that you go to experience a kind of predetermined idea of what experiencing music or art is.
Yeah, the 20th century bohemian LARP. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's very powerful.
It is.
And it's still pervasive in a lot of creative industries, you know. Unfortunately that's not the world that we exist in anymore, but like the idea of like having that kind of romantic life of like coming to New York in the 1970s and like working part-time and bumming around and making some weird art or music or whatever, like that
there's not going to be an Abby
anymore.
Hoffman now, do you know what I mean, who's like writing "Fuck the System" or something like that becomes a massive. And also one of the things, the problem is that like all of this trickle-down stuff, like when I spoke about like Throbbing Gristle or like Peter Gabriel at the same time looking at the Fairchild and thinking what to do with it, like Throbbing Gristle were like art school kids with no money that were making this noise that people with money took inspiration from and turned into a mainstream kind of sonic change in music and stuff like that. If that's not happening, you're not going to get inspiration from anywhere. Do you know what I mean? So, a lot of artists now, like this small crew of us, whether it be me, Dijon, Bon Iver, McGee, whoever it is, are all constantly talking about like, what does it sound like to make music now? Do you know what I mean? And we're all trying to kind of push ourselves forwards.
Well, I mean, I think we share this this interest that a lot of the most kind of interesting, weird, experimental, avant-garde culture has moved online in the last few years. And if I'm pulling inspiration to make new material, like that's where I look. That's where I look for the new exciting. That's where I look for the exciting new thing.
Yeah.
Your forthcoming album title pulls a quote from a very interesting online subculture. Do you want to tell us a bit about the rabbit holes you've been exploring?
I'll say one thing first. I think that we spoke about Marvel before, and we spoke about other, let's say like huge music artists that operate more as like a corporation. They've really cottoned on to this postmodern meta thing that happens in art now. So a Marvel movie will be 60% in jokes and callbacks to other Marvel movies.
And in the franchise.
Exactly. Yeah. And these artists now will put out a record where half the record is self-referential jokes to the lore that exists outside of the record. What they end up start doing is kind of forgetting that that's all cool detail if you've made something objectively good.
Right.
So if this objectively good album or movie has a subtext that's interesting, that has all of these theories, that's great. So I say that because what I want to do is make a great album. I'm not I'm not going tomorrow to teach at the School of Design and Aesthetics and do some kind of academic treaty. I'm making a record.
I'm literally doing that tomorrow.
You're literally doing that tomorrow. And I am going to make
a record
that
tomorrow.
people like. And it's not that I've never made music for an audience or made music that I expect people want to listen to, but I just naturally make melodically quite relatable music. So my next record will be hopefully an enjoyable 1975 record objectively, and it will be about all of the theory, what my records are always about: love, sex, death, communication.
Good things to make art about.
You know, all the big things. But the framework in which I talk about that from A Brief Inquiry onwards has kind of been the same. How are we and why are we communicating in the ways that we do, and what are its impacts? So the new record is I suppose born from me nearly going insane, and that being a kind of an internet-induced insanity combined with the cautionary tale of my last record, which was essentially like, don't get red-pilled and black-pilled. Try normal life maxing.
That's good advice.
It's kind of about the intersection of those concepts. So how religious fanaticism plays a significant role in the evolution of kind of internet insanity, online schizo stuff. My Instagram feed now is just mentally unwell people expressing themselves in different ways, not from a voyeuristic enjoyment place. I'm just really, really interested in this new environment that people have. And there's a big intersection between the themes and behaviors observed both in the red-pilled community and the kind of, let's call it the online schizo community.
Yes.
And I think those are the intersection between apocalyptic and kind of millenarian beliefs.
Yes.
The dichotomy between good and evil, the concept of prophets and gurus, the rejection of mainstream authority, the kind of symbolism and numerology that these communities get obsessed with, and the moral absolutism of both sides, and the kind of sacred texts and doctrines that they hold dear. I'm seeing a big cross-section there, and I think that because a lot of my records and my ideas are delineated through even imagery, you know, like my campaigns that surround the album are just as important as the album itself. And those are the theories that I'm kind of, that are the framework for what we're kind of working on.
It makes a lot of sense as someone who pulls inspiration from social media that I would say that our current design of the platforms are kind of like designed to be schizophrenia inducing, right? Where if you feel a little bit paranoid or delusional that there's a whole bunch of people who are following you, tracking your every move, like finding hidden messages, and then they're gonna maybe advertise to you, I'm not sure. Yeah. That's just literally true on social media.
Yeah,
it is a schizophrenia inducing machine.
That's right.
And so people who are a little bit mentally ill then become very mentally ill once given social media.
Of course,
and that's happening to smaller degrees to all of us because these tools are so powerful, they're so overwhelming, and it has devastating social effects.
It really does, yeah. And the way that, so what I'm trying to kind of get to is, you know, is broad examples, songs that kind of speak of it without being songs that try and be academic papers, you know?
The one thing I would add is that sometimes people feel they feel a little embarrassed or like self-indulgent if they're making work about like romance and heartbreak and sex and leisure and just kind of like the everyday experiences of life because they feel like they're supposed to make art about like big political topics, right? And I would say that this is, we've been having a very political conversation, contextualizing all of this. I think that is a necessary part of the discursive component of art is to understand the underlying political economic mechanisms that produce culture, right? All these things are downstream of our economy. But I think those are actually great things to make art about. I think some of the best art is actually just about heartbreak. And it's something that you can actually pursue through art, whereas you try to pursue activism and politics and so on, art is not very well equipped to do that.
No, it's
so
not.
Understanding the appropriate context for these things, I think, is actually an important distinction.
You have to be a very particular person to read whether it's even a piece of pop philosophy or an academic kind of thesis, and be transformed immediately as a person. Whereas you can be kind of anybody but a Philistine to hear a record and be completely changed as a person. Do you know what I mean? Like, music has this really transformative power that words and like I always say, you know, words, visuals, literature, they're kind of suggestive of how you feel, but music, even ambient music, commands you how to feel.
I've heard you talk about sincerity before. I think that irony and irony poisoning, especially for the demographic, the subculture of young men that you've been interested in pulling from for the last record, a lot of them were so boiled in that irony that they didn't really know what they actually thought about the world in many cases. And I wonder if you would share maybe your experience of moving through irony to sincerity and understanding yourself in the world, understanding what you really think about a topic.
I think that being English, you're kind of taught that embarrassment and a really scrutinized version of self-awareness is paramount. Do you know what I mean? So we're always kind of ironic in the face of authenticity or irony. Do you know what I mean? So basically what I learned, and I've said this before, is kind of summarized in that David Foster Wallace quote where he says, to be truly human is to be a bit goo-prone, a bit soppy, a bit naive, and open to earnest, sometimes what could be described as soppy things. And I think that it's so much easier to fight or combat those things with irony or just taking the piss. But if you dethrone sincerity with irony, you eventually get an equal tyrant. You know, that's kind of the way that I feel about it. That it gets to a point where it's not a replacement. It's just another way of doing it. And it's not really a means to an end. Like, irony is, for me now, a tool to highlight very, very specific things that need to be highlighted, whereas it used to be a defense mechanism.
Yes.
I think my turn towards sincerity from my third album onwards was also a reaction to being part of the indie music scene of the 2000s in the UK. So the indie music scene was defined by being a slacker. So when you were on stage, you had to essentially be like, I am going to pretend that I don't care, so I can't be judged for not being very good. Right? That was kind of the concept.
That's a good
I'm going to replace all ambition.
I wasn't even trying.
I'm not even fucking trying.
It's not that I
And also,
suck.
I don't really care. Like, for example, there's this idea of, I'm going to pretend to not care so I don't get judged about not being very good. And everybody was a bit shit on their instrument. And I used to feel like, well, if you don't care, why the fuck should I care?
Right.
Like, I care about stuff that I wouldn't read something that I didn't feel somebody cared about. Do you know what I mean? So I think that one of those things as well, it was this sardonic, ironic, I don't care attitude that defined being successful in rock music.
Sure.
And I just found I was like, yeah, cool, but that's just that. How long is that going to last? Do you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't really mean anything. And, which is why I was always more into One Last Wish or Fugazi than I was into Minor Threat. Do you know what I mean? The hardcore stuff was cool, but the reflective, emotional stuff that wasn't that immediately co-opted by just like skinheads and people who wanted to have a fight. Do you know what I mean? Like, I was more attracted to that stuff. So yeah, so I think that sincerity, like I said, is really important because it's not incentivized. You don't get a lot of credit for it.
Yeah.
You know? And also it kind of comes along with sincerity for me has really encouraged me to focus on in the frame of what we're talking about, it being online, is always being concerned with doing the right thing as opposed to being seen to do the right thing. So doing the right thing often requires quite a lot of sacrifice and very little reward. Being seen doing the right thing requires very little sacrifice and often garners a lot of reward. So when I think about, am I doing the right thing? I often think, am I going to be rewarded for this? If I am, I'll try and limit the ways in which I could be rewarded for it, for the thing. Being of service for other people, especially when you're like a frontman in a band, they're very important to kind of stay grounded. But so yeah, that's why I think that it's been very, very important to kind of not adhere to the cynicism that is kind of out there on either side. Do you know what I mean? Like that is now existing on the kind of extremes. I just think that like sincerity, long-term satisfaction, being measured, empathy, listening, they're just not incentivized. They're just not really part of what we're doing. And I think that like...
We need being a normal person maxing.
We need being a normal person maxing. And I think that one of the privileges that I have is that I have the ability to make long form pieces. I told you this story, right? I was talking to a kid who was like the son of a music executive. I've said this online before, and I said, what kind of music do you like? And he said, I don't really know. I was like, well, what kind of what artists do you listen to? And he was like, I was like, well, what songs do you like? And he said, what full songs?
Oh my God. Oh boy.
So the decimal,
he is doing them on TikTok or something?
The decimal point of where we thought the smallest denomination, you have the song, the album, the catalog, it's moved.
The TikTok.
So, you know, so you have people now making records with 2-minute songs and stuff like that. And the thing is with that is such a symptom of the incentivization of short-term pleasure that I'm quite happy to make essentially long-form statements that require concentration. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And a lot of people are not in the economic position to do that. You know? But a lot of people are.
And they choose not to.
And they choose not to for really neglectful reasons and really like kind of, I think like disrespectful reasons to the form. Do you know what I mean? Like there's too much content in general, but you could argue that we are now in the golden age of TV. Now, I think that started happening because you kind of have these almost like Gutenberg moments, right? So I think that when there's this, Douglas Copeland will talk about this idea that when a dominant media platform is superseded by a new one, it opens the previous one up to become more artful. So, for example, just to explain to people, the TV used to, you could only have a half-hour show on TV because the TV was the only thing we had. So you couldn't take up 2.5 hours because everyone else has got to do their thing. When the internet came on and people started watching content in other places and the TV became not so constricted by actual time, you got The Sopranos, you got The Wire, you got 6 Feet Under, you got all of these shows that had like Dostoevsky level narratives that went on for years. Do you know what I mean?
You can even say the emergence of photography, that it unburdened painting with the task of having to represent the world, and so you got
video, radio, all
yeah.
of these kind of things. That is happening with the internet a little bit now, as we start to talk about the delineation between the clear net space and the dark forest kind of environment. That is happening. There is a more creative, subversive form of art happening on your Patreons, Substacks, and below, which used to be people writing for magazines and people being involved with institutions. And I think that even though there's a lot of content out there, you could argue that we're in the golden age of TV right now. And you could argue that we're not in the golden age of film, but I don't think that we are that outside of your big mainstream movies. I don't think we're that starved for good filmmaking that is kind of pushing things forward, even on a mainstream level, if you look like the Safdies or if you look at like, you know.
Sure.
Music, though, is not in that place. And
Why isn't music in that place?
I think it's because, I'm not going to summarize it, I'll just give you an example. You're a cute young girl or boy on the internet, and you establish a fan base as a young model from the ages of 17 to 21, and you get millions of followers.
Sure.
As a person, you get to an age where you want to start authenticating this or giving this a reason, kind of like, you know, you want it to have a reason as opposed to my tits or my haircut or how good I am at whatever. What a lot of them will do is pick up a ukulele or an acoustic guitar,
right?
And within a month, you will have a bedroom EP from this artist.
Yeah. Yep.
And so you'll immediately get a link to their SoundCloud. So they'll go from being an influencer now to a musician. There's a shortcut through using social media to get a job or a position or be regarded as a musician. You can't do that with being a screenwriter. You can't do that with being a director.
You can do it in your bedroom.
Yeah, you can do it.
You can make it on your laptop.
You can make it on your laptop.
It can be given to a wide audience. You know, it's not
and
like.
And also, it's not seen as what? Like if you are this social influencer and you go one day, here's my SoundCloud link. People go, oh. If you go, hey guys, here's a link to my script. Or here's
not a lot of clicks for
like,
that.
What?
No.
Here's your what? You're a what? Why are you that? I don't care about that. Do you know what I mean? Whereas, so I don't know. There's partially, I feel that that's happening in music a little bit.
My sense of this stuff is that growing up in the society that we did, you're accustomed to having like a level of trust in institutions that when I grab the box of cereal off of the shelf, it's not going to have metal shavings and wood chips in it. Like there are bare minimum standards that someone has looked at this, it meets safety protocols and
why we
whatever.
get on the plane, yeah.
Yeah, and this is why when a medication is revealed to have negative side effects, then there's penalties, financial penalties to the pharmaceutical company and whatever. But in the last few decades, especially, I mean, think of the opioid crisis, think of all of like the negative health effects and all of the endocrine disrupting chemicals and just the shit that's in all of our foods. Like that shit is, I mean, it's just the fucking Wild West. Like we are in a blasted libertarian hellscape and there is no institution that is checking any of this for safety protocols.
And everything's unregulated.
Definitely not social media.
No.
And so the negative externalities of the terrible design of all of these platforms is making people literally fucking insane and schizophrenic and also just producing really, really unhealthy social patterns.
Yeah.
And because I think, we grew up in a period where our parents had, the relatively like stable period of life in the advanced world, we just had this kind of benign, naive faith that these institutions would take care of us, but they are not at all.
No,
and we're just living in the wreckage of all of these things.
It's all at the expense of neoliberalism's intent on...
Oh, the market will regulate it. That's what they'll say. Is that like,
exactly.
Oh, people will just divest.
Exactly.
They'll like spend their dollars elsewhere if they don't like it.
And it's all about choice at the detriment of what those choices may entail. You have to be able to self-determine. You have to be able to self-actualize. You have to be able to do that. That's what we're going to provide the individual. And it's like, yeah, but we're eventually just going to burn out. and
Right,
we're eventually
right.
just gonna.
Right, there's a limit to like consumer responsibility. It's like, am I supposed to individually conduct all the scientific tests to see if there's like plastic in this food?
Exactly,
or like,
right?
You know, are you going to have to look at like every individual
And I
car
think
to compare
because
them?
social media
yeah,
is
you have
has
to
be-
trust someone at some point.
Yeah, exactly. And because social media has just been inherently put into this part of our life, which is about self-expression and self-determination,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
we are terrified of regulating it for being perceived as.
I mean, other countries have figured this out. You know, I hate to make the comparison, but like you log onto TikTok or Douyin as it's called in China, like you're limited to an hour a day, right? And the content is also curated. It's like educational, it's wholesome or whatever. And then in the United States, we have all of these libertarian ethics where it's like, well, if people don't like it, they'll look away. It's like, no, you just gave a slot machine to every child in the United States, 250 million monthly active users, and they're all just fucking swiping slot machines like boomers in a casino.
100%.
Give me a fucking break.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
no, you need someone to regulate this shit. It is unhealthy and it has bad effects.
Yeah, there's loads exactly, because it teaches also like an environment. I would suggest people to go and watch your work that you did on. Josh did this kind of analysis, this kind of, I suppose, this rabbit hole piece where you went into this part of the internet that was filled of kind of like young people that were operating as like a video game server in the way that they were communicating, and all of these political ideologies kind of being jettisoned into this environment. And consequently, what resulted of that is you can see in Josh's work and Josh's piece. But it is very difficult to kind of think of how to regulate these things, because you know, you can look at an empathy issue if you know, when you're a young person, you're trying stuff out. Louis C.K. said this before. It's like the first time you're just trying stuff out when you're kids, you try out being mean, and you're in the playground and you say to a kid, you're fat. And that kid goes, oh. And then you go, oh, that didn't make me feel good.
Like
I'm not going to
that.
do that.
Yeah.
Whereas if the first time you say you're fat is on in a comment thread and you get no emotional reaction, you get 1,000 likes.
Yeah.
Your view.
Oh, this feels pretty good, actually.
Exactly. So I think that the idea of kind of like of how, but again, this is the problem. It's the same thing with like guns, like or prohibition. If you provide society with something.
Oh, you make it desirable when you're not allowed to have it?
If you like give society alcohol and then you go, nah, that was a bad idea, you get what happened during Prohibition. Do you know what I mean? Or if you give society guns and you get to like now and you try and regulate it, you get in the issue that you can't really take something back from a society that you've kind of allowed to become fabric of, because let's say an amnesty of social media only addresses the people that want an amnesty within social media. Same with guns, same with these kind of things, you know what I mean? So I don't actually know how you start now regulating things without it being something that seems totalitarian.
Have you considered though, so I'll say I'm not totally sure my feelings on this, or whether this bears out in like 5 to 10 years, for example. But I have noticed a trend. I always give this example of there were a duo of artists at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and at the time that we all got on social media, they happened to have more followers than Pace Gallery, which is like this, $100 million, like very lucrative blue chip gallery. If you've made it up there, like your career is set, you're at the top of the market, top of the museums. And the early adopter benefit for millennials on social media was enormous, because we were actually we had a quantitatively larger reach than some of the major brands, because they were slow to get on there. But what we've learned now, one generation removed, is that the Gen Z kids, if they try to get on social media, they've got like 100 followers of their friends. But Pace Gallery has like 100 million, or maybe it's 100,000 or somewhere like that. But there's not the early adopter benefit. And so sometimes it's difficult to not over-index the millennial experience that is just our experience of social media. And there may be the possibility, I've heard the most crude, cynical way I've heard this phrased is that millennials were the only generation selfish enough to like get on social media, narcissistic enough to get on social media, and maybe actually for kids younger than us, they might just opt out of the whole experience.
Well, I think
that's the most optimistic version.
I think that just because of the way that being a teenager has always existed. Being a teenager is not being a grown-up. So whatever grown-ups are doing...
because we're all adults on
This is the
social
thing.
media.
So what a teenager
like,
is looking at grown-ups and going, that's gay. Sorry, you don't say that.
They're all
that's
doing
lame.
activism on social media.
Exactly.
I don't want to do any of that shit.
That's fucking lame. I'm not doing that shit. So if everybody who's older than you is just going, Kamala is brat, or whatever the fuck they're doing, teenagers who are normally this is the thing. Young Fisher's problem was that the 20th century being defined by lots of ideas was also defined by this idea that young people are always at the forefront of cultural change.
Right, right.
And that was for loads of reasons, because of naturally what they're like, and also because of the way that the 20th century kind of economically was set up.
That could exist
So you
then.
saw the birth of the teenager in the 50s and with the Beats, really. Then the articulation of that idea with the hippies into the punks.
Right.
And I think that like being a young person has always been inherently countercultural or aligning with a culture. So you were either like in Vietnam or like completely anti-Vietnam.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So, you know, it used to be a very, very kind of thing.
The youth was leading the culture for all of those decades up until... I mean, when? Is it like 2008 where that cuts off? Or like, because it doesn't feel that way now.
No, it doesn't
right?
feel like it doesn't feel like that now. That it feels like young people are subjected to, listen, you just said to me, there's not anybody doing what you're doing in this particular space.
Right.
It's like, I know. And there really should be. And it's not just because like I'm ambitious.
Yeah.
There should be young people being funded to have those kind of lofty aspirations. Like that's the issue that we've got. Like the most talented young person who's really creative, you know, like I said, will be doing the flat design for some internet company.
Last year, you made an exceptional video series, a piece called A Theatrical Performance of an Intimate Moment. 4-part series.
It was, we did 4 of them at that time, yeah.
Episode 2, I was very much touched by.
Thank you.
The Fort episode,
I call
it. I really love that.
Thank you.
It got me in my childhood experience very much. What did you want to explore with that series? Why did you choose to make an art piece like this? You're busy enough, aren't you? You're touring, you're making the next album. Why was this important for you to make?
It was a reaction to our social media, which is essentially a content platform being used primarily to just advertise the show. So it would just be a series of kind of images of the show. And after a while, you know, I always love, we grew up in emo, so any kind of BTS Warped Tour. I used to love like tour documentary stuff, and I've always kept cameras, even though we filmed everything, I've never put any footage out of our studio sessions, or there's not that much BTS stuff, just because I've been making this film for 10 years that I'll probably never even make, but I've filmed everything. But for a theatrical performance of an intimate moment came from the fact that that's what the live show and my entire life had started to feel like. Do you know what I mean? The intimate moment being me essentially simulating masturbation in my house on a stage. Do you know what I mean? It was a theatrical performance of that. The me literally. Yes. It was literally that. And I think that I wanted to extend that concept out until what was happening around the show. So instead of just doing a straight up tour documentary, I wanted to do something that was a little bit conceptual, that still kind of explored some of the ideas that were in the show. The first one was a kind of almost like a jokingly on the nose parody of like Woody Allen, do you know what I mean? Because we were in New York and we were just, me and Jordan were just, we were just doing it on the fly, and we would just write these little skits and then we'd go out and we'd shoot them. It's actually, it is essentially the kind of precursor internet web series version of a proper thing that I'm I don't know when I'll do it, but that I've been working on trying to do. The thing with the theatrical performance is that all of these ideas of my art or my expression being permeated with this feeling of surveillance and, I would say, eeriness, to quote Fisher again, in a specific way. If you look up, his difference between the weird and the eerie.
Yeah.
I had a very eerie upbringing, as much as I had an amazing upbringing, wonderful relationship with my family, and that kind of millennial, brilliant childhood that a lot of us had. But I was quite a thoughtful, introspective kid. And for example, my mum was, two examples that I remember massively that have informed all of my work was my parents doing two different shows. My mum once was in a Catherine Cookson TV show, which was a writer who would write about, dramas, period dramas. So I remember being 5 years old, my mum left for work, and I was going to go and see her at 4 p.m. at work. And when I arrived at work, it was the 1800s. And my mum was an old woman.
Well.
And I was 5. And she was still my mum.
Yeah.
And she came over to me and everything was really...
Right.
But I was presented with this concept of subjective reality.
Sure.
Of being like, okay, this isn't real. This is all an artifice. But I can get lost in this at any moment.
It's a fully dressed
it's a
set
fully
and
dressed
everything's
set,
totally immersive.
And it felt kind of eerie because it felt real and unreal at the same time. And I think that feeling was driven home when I went to see my dad in a play called Art. And my dad played, out of 3 men, the least strong, least masculine, least assertive of this friendship group.
Right.
And in the play, the 2 characters who are bigger than my dad get into an altercation. My dad gets in the way and ends up getting punched in the face. And it's this big emotional point in the play where everybody goes, oh, because you really don't want that character to get hit.
Yeah.
Now, I was watching that in a theater and I saw my dad get punched in the face, and I wanted to react to it, but my reaction would have been socially inappropriate.
So as a child,
so
people would fight like, my dad could beat up your dad.
The biggest nightmare of being a small child as a boy is watching your dad lose a fight.
Yeah, worst fear.
Watching it and then not being able to react to it because it would be rude or it would stop people's enjoyment of watching it. I remember thinking, okay, there is a very, very flimsy line between reality and not. Do you know what I mean? Which is when I got really interested in postmodern art and people like Andy Kaufman and all of these kind of people that would play with these environments. One of the reasons that I'm not really interested in doing press with any traditional media, even if we do desire the return of institutions, is because my mum was brutally hacked and surveilled by like a soon-to-be-known news organization. Same news organization that ended up getting the News of the World cancelled. And so when I was younger, I learned of all these stories that I'd slept in hotel rooms that had been bugged, and people that I had met with my mum had actually been essentially kind of like media spies who had taken me off to try and befriend me and then get information from my mum. And only over the past couple of years, I learned that I was actually hacked for 5 years.
Wow. So
every phone conversation that I had from the age of 18 to 24 was listened to. And this is an era when my brother was very ill. My parents were going through a divorce.
Jesus.
I was kind of dealing with, I think I was probably just around about starting to deal with my heroin habit. And everybody knows the feeling of, a lot of people will know the feeling of how it feels after somebody has been into your house and stolen something.
Yeah.
You feel so impersonally invaded. You feel dirty and you feel uncomfortable and you feel unsafe. And that's because somebody has come in and taken or played or fucked around with your things. When people do that with your thoughts and your conversations, you know, people don't realize like how much that old way of treating people in the media, like Sienna Miller didn't talk to her mum for 4 years because a newspaper hacked her answering machine and released information that she had only ever spoken about with her mum.
Wow.
in public. And for her, there was no way that her mum didn't do that. And she didn't speak to her for 4 years.
Yeah.
Now, how like degrading that can be to your personal relationships, especially like your relationship with the media and stuff like that. And
so was this video series a way of kind of like controlling your own life, taking back your own character and identity?
yeah, I mean, I don't want to take it like that seriously, but what it was me starting to experiment with, you know, kind of creating something that I felt was like authentic and also kind of scripted, but not scripted in order to conceal information, almost scripted to reveal more than what a normal prosaic conversation can.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? People used to watch dramas and they would invest in the narratives of the characters. When reality TV happened, we very quickly went, oh, this is great because the consequences are real. That's when that happened. Then with your big brothers that started to articulate that, they went, oh, you like the consequences being real. Do you want to phone in and decide what actually happens?
Right. Yeah.
Then we get into this model, which I think was the precursor for how we now operate with famous people on social media. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like...
Yeah, proto-social media.
Yeah, we like to be in control of the narrative of this person. Do you know what I mean? Especially if they give us loads. So I think that whether it's the last show or a theatrical performance of an intimate moment, I'm always kind of interested in playing with, with those ideas. It's difficult to articulate, actually.
Well, scripting something, I think of this as a way of taking back your own words, of like owning the things that you say. Whereas if you're surveilled, the things that you say are taken from you. And so reenacting these things is a way of, kind of like owning your own experience, that it's yours, you choose to release it, it's voluntary rather than it's something that happens to you involuntarily.
I think you're very right. I think that's probably I think that's a massive part of what it is, yeah. That at least I can construct the narrative myself. Do you know what I mean? Even if it is constructed and needs to be constructed. Once you start constructing a real life personality, you want people to believe this is the real authentic version of me. That's something that you need to like keep up with. Yes. And that's difficult, do you know what I mean? Because people are dynamic and they change their mind. And I think that, I think that being able to control some form of narrative in an environment where that's just completely taken away from you, do you know what I mean? Is important to me just as much with that stuff as it is with like the show.
Yeah, you become the director of your own life again. Yeah.
If I have to, yeah.
Is there anything you want to say about the new album? Themes you're going to explore, material that inspires you, topics you want to address?
Well, like I've said to you, I'm not really interested in doing press surrounding it, mainly because outside of the show and the album, the albums that I've made, which are truly the only things that I'm interested in. I think because I study and talk about culture like in my work, I think people maybe misinterpreted that I'm as personally invested as I am interested in the phenomenology of what's happening. So for example, last year I became a a way more well-known public figure for loads of different reasons.
Yes.
And the only reason that I was interested in is kind of like what I was doing. So I think that a lot of artists, they become very interested in their lore, or they become interested in the things that have happened outside of their art that people know about, and they want to address that. And fair enough, do you know what I mean? But maybe on my first record, when it was very much like a series of journal entries with like little bits of heartbreak and all of these stories about, I used to write about relationships a lot more and stuff like that. Maybe I'd be inclined to kind of like reflect on my experience as a person. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
More as an artist, but honestly, I would kind of just be lying. You know, like if I made a record about, I don't know, all the stuff that was said about me, or my casual romantic liaisons, or whatever it may be that I've kind of become known for just because I was famous, I think that's an obvious thing to draw from. I'm just not interested in it. And I think that like the maintenance of the status quo is something that I always like fight against. So the idea of making a record about something that personally happened to me, that by the time I put it out is going to be like 2 years old. Do you know what I mean? I see people doing that as well. And it's just like, it's not like, you know, it's not interesting. So again, my work is, I hope, you know, interesting art pop that provokes, that maybe helps popularize academic subjects that I'm really interested in. And because I don't have a blueprint of how to make a record that people want to hear, the only thing I've ever done is just be like, make something you're really interested in, you know? And so that's just basically what I'm doing. And, you know, we're as interested in the culture war as we are interested in some kind of niche, archaic economic model that we've read about. Do you know what I mean? I'm just not interested in that kind of stuff. It doesn't make interesting work. And I think that if everyone else's work is going to be about that, I'd rather kind of stick to what I'm good at, which is maybe being like a kind of outsider on the inside. I'm not interested in being provocative or contrarian at all. I find it kind of tired and quite old-fashioned, and also a kind of a type of behavior that I've already drawn inspiration from and shown examples of. I just want to make work that is inspiring. Not necessarily, I don't want to make work with an audience in mind. I want to have my work exist outside of a lot of contemporary music that is very interested in short-term gains, whether that be getting attention, whether that be getting credit. I'm really, really suspicious of those ideas. And I'm also, so I think that I just want my work to be something that challenges people in the moment, as opposed to delivers what they think they want. So that's what I want to do. Like, I kind of just want to like quietly calmly and in a long form way, like have an effect on the culture, you know, in a different way to the way that I did when we first came out, you know, because a lot of this idea of the same artists being around 20 years later,
right,
a lot of them are dialing it in, and it's fine. But I think that, like, you know, if you're going to still be there, you've got to keep making a reason why you're there. Do you know what I mean? So that's what I'll try and do. So unfortunately, no heartbreak, no like kind of, well, I'm sure there'll be some like, maybe like some kind of love songs on there, but there's not, I think that, yeah, I'm not in the world of, did you see what happened? Here's my version of it kind of thing. You know, I think that that's for other artists to do, you know?
Matty, thank you for sitting with me here today. I have to say, I'm just such an immense fan of your work. You're an extraordinary musician. You're an incredible artist. And I'm glad that we finally got to have this conversation on camera for once and talk about some of these ideas, bring attention to the work and the ideas that we care about. And it's just been wonderful sitting with you here
honestly,
today.
It's such an honor being able to do this with you, because, you know, there's a handful of people that I really look to or admire in the art world. That's how we kind of became parasocial and then IRL buddies. So yeah, no, like I said, this will be an interesting cross-section of my fans and your fans. So hello to all of the Josh stans, and thank you for having me. As you will probably know, you know, Josh is brilliant, and I would advise all of my fans to check out your work as well, even if it's just to give more context onto kind of what I do and what this kind of group of artists are trying to achieve, even though we're so multidisciplinary.
Yeah,
you know?
Our lack of faith in the existing institutions means that we need to work together to build the context through which to understand this work. So I very much feel that peership with you. I feel it with Brad. I feel it with the New Models podcast and the shirt I happen to be wearing today.
I feel like with Do Not Research, again, something I would tell people to check out, because like you said, these conversations, they're great for the prescriptive element, but I think that once we've had all of these, we need to move into the diagnostic.
Make stuff.
We've got to move into the diagnostic. Yeah, so we need to start
publish.
Looking at what these alternative institutions mean. And one of the things that requires is dropping any form of kind of like art school hipster cynicism for a sincerity that allows you to try and like change the world.
You can't build something you don't believe in.
Exactly. Yeah. That's so true. So thank you for having me again. It was, like I said, I didn't, me talking on camera was not on my, bingo card for the next 2 years. So it's funny that you called me up, especially in between campaigns, but I think that it's been perfect, because due to a lot of the context collapse that went around the last show, I think that it's been important for me to check in with my fans, because I think that there was this maybe concept that because what I was doing was spiky, I was maybe being a bit thoughtless, do you know what I mean? Or performative, and people started to lose their grasp of who I was as an artist, which was the point.
Right.
But it's been really, really nice. And sorry, since then I've not spoken. I've only performed. So I've not been able to kind of, you know, to reassure people that I'm not a red-pilled
down the rabbit hole
edgelord. I'm merely somebody like yourself who has been truly fascinated with the phenomena of how we're communicating. And so thank you again. And I'll talk to you on the phone, but I'll see everybody else like when I do a show.
Matty, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.